Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hybrid Ministries Tech Forum. This is week 4. We have about 200 people registered now, and our Discord's filling up with curated information and ideas on topics such as audio, music, production, copyrights, needs assessments, and financing. We're having discussions and responding to questions all week long, so please remember to visit the Discord and talk to us. Let us know what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're stressed about, what you're feeling good about. We're here to help. We've developed our agenda for the next couple of weeks, and we really want to hear from you whether we're on track. We realize that you are a mix of technical and non-technical people, and we want to provide the information that some information that everybody will find valuable. So in addition to non-tech topics such as needs assessments, financing, and copyrights, we're planning to cover technical topics at an overview level for the non-techies, and then spend some time diving deeper to help techies elevate their abilities and their performance. For example, I know that we want to take a detailed look at mixing consoles and the mixing process. We can explore best practices for camera work, such as setting white balance and irises, how to use a camera controller to do smooth pans and tilts, how to set up video switchers, and specifically what automation control systems can work for you as well as for us. We're also exploring some low-cost options for small churches, including an entire production system that runs on tablets and phones. The key is configuring reliable Wi-Fi. And we're lining up guests for interviews. I think we have some pretty cool guests coming up. So let us know if you want more or less technically detailed discussion. And if we schedule another day specifically, what if we schedule another day specifically for a tech talk? That's been floated as an idea, and we want to know what you think about that. So on today's panel, we have David O'Connor from the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he is the tech team coordinator and is a theater director by training. We have Joanna Lovell, or J-Lo to us, who has earned her technology specialist certificate from AVIXA, and she's a virtual content creator, choir director, music minister, audio engineer, and she founded the New Jersey UU Music Ministers Group and collaborates with a number of churches on the East Coast. Mark Plukas from Franklin, Massachusetts is the operations manager for an independent AV control systems programming company, having been in audio engineering and design in the entertainment industry since the 1970s. Jay Paul from Ellicott City, Maryland, is a national key account manager for a leading manufacturer of innovative networked pro audio solutions and a concert sound engineer. He's been a lead audio engineer for SUSE, the Southern Unitarian Universalist Summer Institute, since 2009. We have Crystal V, a freelance knowledge worker and digital nomad who is disrupting before it was a buzzword. Her myriad professional hats include writing, project management, software as a service consultancy, editing, systems administration, web development, technical support, just to name a few. Currently, she's the technical consultant for the UU Church of Jacksonville, Florida, where she utilizes her knowledge of internet free sources for content creation and organic growth. And she's assisting her congregation with hybridization. And today, for the first time, we have Leo Mindell joining us from London. Yes, the British one. He's been the founding director of digital sports agency Sodic, who has been delivering websites and streaming to the world governing bodies for over 20 years, including the first ever live top European soccer match in 2001. I'm your host, Marty Atias of ATS Communications in Silver Spring, Maryland. I've been a media production and communications engineer for 45 years, first in New York City and then in Maryland. My production experience ranges from broadcast radio, television, and music recording and live performance to networking and telephone communications. I'm a consultant, systems design and integration engineer, and I help corporate, retail, and houses of worship clients to make technology work to improve their operations. And I've been a member of UUCSS for 11 years. So how about a hand for our panelists? Thank you all for your invaluable contributions. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. So while some of us on their panel are available for consulting or contracting, this show is not about us. It's entirely about you, and it's your questions and comments that will drive the show's agenda and the topics that we discuss. So we take those questions from the Discord. If you're logged into that, there's a channel there called Questions for the Panel. So please put your questions in there, and any non-questions, comments, or topics, or anything else that you'd like to discuss, please put in the Zoom chat channel, because we want to be able to find your questions very easily. And our panel is open, actually. If you think that you can add value or an alternate viewpoint to our panel and our discussions, then contact me on the Discord and we'll talk. All of your microphones will be muted throughout the show, and questions go in the Q&A that we will read and then discuss for you. You'll also find in the Discord a section of guidelines and rules. Please familiarize yourselves with them. Consider this a professional space, not social media. It's not an advertising or promotional space. So please keep your posts on point and concise. And we have guidelines for posting about equipment recommendations. All right, so we've been talking about the first two steps on the journey from virtual to hybrid ministry, which are determining the goals and using a needs assessment to figure out how to get there. And we will revisit that important second step when we reveal the winners of our contest. It took a bit longer than we had hoped to get the guidance documents posted, so we're open to extending the deadline past March 4th if you need more time, so please let us know. The next step is to break down all of the potential project tasks and work areas into manageable subsystems and to prioritize them. While not everyone will be upgrading every subsystem, the order of priority is important, and it's good to know which ones you should be planning for. So let's review them. Now, there's a channel on the Discord under the technical category called Priorities First, where these are listed with a brief explanation. But let's talk about them. So the very first priority, the bedrock that everything that you do stands on, is networking, your data network, your local area network. And we're going to go into that in more detail in a little bit after we get through all of the priorities. So we'll come back to that one. The second one is sound, and sound is something that we're going to begin talking about next week. So why is sound important? Why is it more important than video, right? Well, we know from lots and lots of experience and field testing and focus groups that anybody watching a visual production, a visual presentation, is more tuned in to the audio, will learn more from the audio, and will gain more of an impression from the audio than they will from the video. Yes, video can be very impressive, can convey a lot of information, but sound without video is called radio. Video without sound is called technical difficulties, and you don't generally have a show without it. So getting your sound right is supremely important. Now, there are a lot of things that can go minor wrong and major wrong with sound, right? One of the minor irritations and frictions is each of the participants or meeting participants being at very different audio levels. So one person speaking very loud, the next person is speaking very soft. You, the viewer, have to go and turn up your volume. Then the first person comes back, you got to turn down your volume. That's a big, huge distraction. And it takes you away from the information that's being conveyed. So we do a quality control check before the show. You'll notice that there is at least 1 or 2 meters in the Zoom call here. One of them is called HMTF meter 1. This is a histogram that shows our levels over time. And when I stop talking, you'll see that audio level drop right off of a cliff. It takes a minute because there's a couple of seconds because there is a latency delay. The other meter is a set of numbers, and they both sort of show the same thing, but in different ways. And what we're trying to do is hit a level that's called minus 24 LUFS, L-U-F-S. And we'll get into that when we get into the sound portion of our journey. Anybody else want to say anything about sound?
It takes 40 years to become somewhat proficient.
Sound is a very deep pool, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's right. It does take a lot of years to have ears. Years for ears.
But with a little bit of assistance, it can be simplified to the point where it can be operated effectively for a worship service or something else. So it's not like you got to start now and 40 years from now you can make your church work. This can all be simplified.
I'm going to say I don't think you need to be into sound for 40 years to really get it together. But you're going to need to be in sound for a while in order to be able to sell yourself as a professional in sound. It takes some time and certainly expertise and the willingness to learn from a lot of other people. But I just did want to say one thing, Marty, that the anecdote I've used about when the audio goes off in a video conference or a broadcast, that's pretty much end of meeting.
Yep. Well, I know that all of our churches have at least one person, hopefully more, that runs sound for services. And some of them are extremely proficient at it. A lot of people, the newer volunteers, they know enough to adjust faders for volume, but they don't really have a much more of a deeper understanding or knowledge of all the other controls that are in a mixer. And people actually are interested in knowing more. There's, aside from the hardware knowledge of what controls what and how do I adjust for this or how do I compensate for that, there's the skill of listening and knowing what to listen for. So if I'm listening to the sermon, how does the voice sound? Is it shrill? Is it dull? Is it screechy? Is it ringing? Ringing is kind of almost like pre-feedback. How intelligible is it? What about speech makes it more or less intelligible? When you're mixing music, is there a way to actually turn up something like a guitar and make it more pronounced without actually making it louder? Yes, there is. And so those are some of the things that we'll be reviewing. Those are some of the more technical topics that we can review about sound that I'm sure all of our volunteers will be interested in. The next priority is lighting, which comes before cameras. What can we say about how lighting affects what the cameras see? I mean, I can sit in the audience and things look perfectly fine to me, but cameras don't quite see everything the way that our eyes do. Our eyes are very amazing, sort of computerized cameras that self-adjust to compensate for poor lighting, but cameras can't do that. So they need good lighting to give good pictures. So that's the next part. Cameras. Then there are multiple types of cameras. There are pan-tilt cameras, there are fixed cameras, there are DSLRs, there are film cameras, video cameras, phones, tablets. How do you choose which one to use? How do you choose where to put them? How high to put them? How close to put them? When would I use one versus another? That's something that we're going to go through. After cameras is video processing, which means switchers, streamers, camera controls. We're going to go through all of that. The next priority is large screen displays like projection or flat panel TVs. And how can they be used to enhance a service for both the in-person audience or congregation and the congregation at home? And then last but certainly not least is training. How do I use all this stuff? How do I teach my people to use all this stuff? We'll have people who get it instantly and people who will be struggling to learn. So training is really important, and ongoing training is also very important. The ability to continue training new volunteers as older volunteers step off for whatever reason. So there you go. That's our 8 priorities in that order. So any questions from our audience so far?
Question in the box. It's about closed captioning. And from Matt Alspaw from Mexico. Welcome, Matt from Mexico. Is there any way to do closed caption on another language, that is real-time translation into example Zoom? I told him the short answer is yes, but we would have to figure that out.
Well, Zoom does have a captioning service that they are providing these days. I don't know if you can choose the language, but I think it can only display one at a time. There are outside third-party services, however, that can also do captioning and transcriptions that can be shown live, and then you can use that as a secondary service to provide an alternate language.
If I can
That's
extend
a very
on,
good questions. Sure. Mm-hmm.
If I extend on that slightly, there is also another service in Zoom, which is the language, which works incredibly well, but you do need a live person. What it does is if you set this up inside Zoom, and then you set somebody as to be a translator, the people who are listening have the original sound of the original person about 20%, and the translator coming in at full volume. So you're actually able to follow. It's like with the hearing the original person at just the 20%, and then the person translating who gets it in their ear, and it does match up. And it's quite amazing when you see it in action.
Is that what he means by closed captioning? I was assuming scrolling words underneath the...
Yeah, the main thing is closed cap. There are 2 different services. There is a closed caption service, which at the moment, the closed captioning service when you have multi-language in a service. So I typically see it with English and Hebrew. It's quite interesting, some of the comments and some of the words it thinks.
Yes.
Are not quite printable, but it's interesting to watch. But the translator service is actually very good when you're going from English to Spanish, etc.
That's fabulous.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, we can move on to our next part of the show. But Let's see, are there any other questions about any of the priorities or why they are priorities or the order of the priorities? And if any of these particular priorities strike your fancy, then there are channels in the Discord for each one of these. So let us know what your questions are about any one of these priorities and what information you want to know or you're missing, it's missing in your knowledge base, and we can try and help fill them in. All right, so are we ready to move on?
I think so. There's nothing else.
I feel like George had posted a really interesting question earlier about wanting to hear more about why. Let me pull up the thing. I'd like to know what's wrong as a first step with having a few laptops and cell phones all on Zoom Wi-Fi using Zoom host as the video mixing control.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Where was that, David? I'm sorry.
It's on in Discord. It's like the first post of today.
Of the day, yeah.
Okay. Good call. Good call.
I just remember reading that earlier and finding that an interesting question. Mark addressed it a little bit.
And yeah,
but I think it's good to open up for a larger conversation.
Yeah, David, you're a little hot too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, my reply to it in the Discord was that there's actually nothing wrong with that. First Universalist Society in Franklin has been doing that since the pandemic started. We use and there's actually our music director's here, and she could elaborate more for you. But we use a combination of a couple of cell phones. You know, one's focused on the chalice, another one's focused on the candles for candles of joy and concern. Michelle sits there with a laptop that's hardwired, not running through the Wi-Fi that she shares content from, recorded materials, things like that. And then we have a better a confidence monitor and a good camera and a laptop and a good microphone focused on the pulpit. And then we have people outside of the church that are not in the sanctuary. Michelle and the minister are the only people in the sanctuary. We have people outside the sanctuary, just like we have here, monitoring things like letting people in, giving technical support, things like that, and doing portions of the service from their homes. It has been working marvelously well through, you know, a lot of Wi-Fi and one wired connection. The sound has been excellent. There's room for improvement. But I think we've been very successful with a near zero investment in high tech to do all of this. It's a great starting point. So I personally find nothing wrong with starting there. And it's a good place to figure out, to help figure out, what are you going to need for human resources to actually manage these things? By doing it the way we did it, we now know we need the following people to do the following things in order to have a successful service. Here's what it looks like to prepare for a successful service when you're doing streaming through something like Zoom. So I find nothing wrong with it personally.
No, it can work very effectively. The one question I would have is that all of those tablets and phones will all be live on the Zoom call all the time. So if you have one pointed at your band or your choir and there's nobody there or people are moving around, people will see that and it could be a distraction. If you, when you have cameras that come into a switcher, then you control what people see, right? With the assorted phones and tablets around, you're really not controlling what people see. You're only controlling what you put in the spotlight. And so that could be a little clunky. And then you have to have audio. Do you have to have audio coming into each device? No, I think you can probably have audio coming in just to the host device, right?
2 devices.
Yeah.
The pulpit and the and then in the case of the music director, she has a live microphone so she can introduce things. Right. Other than that, there's really only 2 devices in the sanctuary. One of them has a really good microphone on it, the one focused on the pulpit. Michelle just uses a lapel that she's wearing. And then, we rely on everybody else. And for the most part, even without good audio at individual people's homes, the intelligibility is just fine for what it is they're doing. After all, it's not a newscast. It's all about understanding what people are saying, not being overwhelmed by how good they sound.
It's all about intelligibility. It's not about being heard. It's about being understood.
Right.
Another couple of concerns I might have are if any one of those devices happens to lose the Zoom call, you have to physically go over there and reestablish the call. Another one is that you're really loading up your Wi-Fi system with multiple incoming and outgoing streams. So while you're primarily going out, Zoom is also bringing stuff in to each and every device. So instead of having one Zoom stream, you've got one for every device that you've got, all over Wi-Fi, all out on your internet too. So your LAN, your local area network infrastructure has to be really solid, as well as really solid Wi-Fi in the room. But yeah, it's workable. I don't know that's the best way to do it, but it's certainly workable.
There's a question in the box that's going to lead us right into the next half of the show, Marty.
Okay.
Sue Royer asks, how much bandwidth is needed to broadcast services if we have wired connections? And Wi-Fi is open, allowed for attendees? I thought that was a good segue.
How much bandwidth you need depends on a number of things. Now, are we talking how much bandwidth you need to purchase from your ISP? Would be, well, I'm going to get into that actually in a couple of minutes. That's part of the presentation. Wi-Fi that's open in the sanctuary would be a bad idea to share that with devices that you have streaming. So yes, if you're streaming, the streaming device wants to be wired. Any other devices that you may have contributing, like it's perfectly fine to have a couple of phones out there for close-up cameras, and they would be communicating to the switcher over Wi-Fi. You could actually have remote contribution using phones coming into OBS using a product called OBS Ninja, which is a very interesting thing. So you don't need to set up a separate Zoom call for them. But we'll talk about that in the coming weeks. So networking. Hey, okay. So hopefully that's not reversed for everybody, is it?
That's way too complicated, Marty.
It's not.
Yes, well, isn't it? Okay. Yeah, networking. Networking can be very complicated, but we're not going to get into all of that right now. We're going to get into some very simple stuff, just the basics, please, of networking. So, for example, okay, this should be changing sources. Okay, hang on a second. All right. So this is what we basically know as a home routing system, home router, or sometimes known as a Wi-Fi router. And it's typically provided by your telephone company or your cable TV company. And it may look like this. Now, on one side of this device is the wire that comes in from outside of the property. It connects to your ISP, your DSL modem, your fiber optic cable, or your coax cable for cable TV. And in a typical home or very small office, this is what a local area network or what your entire network may look like. This device here, actually, let me do this. this device here, where is it? Here we go. This device here connects to all of your different devices here at home. However, this device is actually much more than a router. It's actually 5 devices in one. So from the internet, there's the gateway stage, the firewall stage, the router, and then the switch. And it's also a Wi-Fi access point. The gateway is what converts your ISP, your internet service provider's signal, into an Ethernet signal that you can plug in anywhere in your house or your small office. The firewall blocks unwanted incoming messages. So for example, if you call up a web page, you're sending a message out to a server somewhere, and it will respond with a message coming to you. That's the content of the page. You requested that page, so it is authorized to send you that information. But if a server somewhere out there tried to access your network and send you information that you didn't ask for, that's the job of the firewall, is to block that. The next stage is the router, which determines which messages coming from inside the network stay inside the network to go to a different device, and which messages pass through, like a request for a web page. The switch is what actually connects all of your computers together and your Wi-Fi. And when a device logs into your network, the switch actually keeps a list of all of those devices. And it knows if you want to communicate from one device to another device, it knows where that device is, what its address is, and how to find it. So that kind of communication doesn't even get to the router. That's handled entirely within the switch. Now, if there's a message that's supposed to be delivered to a device that it doesn't know about, it's not on the list, then it sends that out to the router, and then the router knows to send it out to the internet. The Wi-Fi access point extends your wired network to wireless devices. And that's pretty much all it does. It allows wireless devices to see each other and talk to each other, and it also allows them to see wired devices on the network as well. And like any other device, it can travel through the switch, the router, the firewall, the gateway, and get out to the internet. So here's what a small business network might look like. You have the internet, goes into this router, which also has the gateway and firewall in it. There's a separate device, which is the Wi-Fi access point that connects all your wireless devices. And there's a wire that goes between those two. So the Wi-Fi access point is actually a wired device to the router. Then there's a switch. Now this is a rather large switch. You can have 24, 48 ports, more or less. And then that gets wired to maybe an office or a small suite of offices with another switch in it. We call a sub-switch. And that will connect all of the PCs in that office or small group of offices. And there's a wire that goes between this switch, and then another one that goes between this switch and this switch. Now, if we look at a bit of a larger office, I'm sorry, you may not have seen my pointer. We go to a larger office, it may have multiple floors or multiple buildings. Then you would put other switches that connect together. So this would be the main switch. Here's a sub switch. Here's another sub switch. And then these go out to different areas on different floors or different buildings. It might even connect to your VoIP telephones. And you may have a file server somewhere on the property that's used for file sharing. Like if you have committee reports that you want everybody to be able to easily find. This is like a Google Drive, but you own it and it's on your premises and is not available to the public. So this is a typical business network, or enterprise network as we call it. And something to be just aware of, and this is a question. So the whole idea here is for people who are non-technical, for non-IT people, non-IT people, when you're talking with an IT person, maybe as a contractor, maybe as one of your volunteers, maybe as one of your staff, and you're talking about doing a network upgrade or determining whether your network currently meets your needs, you want to have an idea of what you're talking about. Like if you were building a home, well, you know where the walls, the doors, the windows are supposed to go. You know the height of the ceiling. You can talk to your contractor about these things. Can you talk to your IT people about where your walls and windows are? So that's what we're trying to do here. Give you sort of a lay of the land, a bit of an understanding about the different components that go into a network and how they're all connected. And here's the important part. So you have a group of computers right here, and they're talking to this switch over this wire. Whatever work they're doing is requiring bandwidth. So as a sum total, all of that bandwidth is traveling over this one wire to this switch. Same thing goes for here. They're going to this switch, and then the subtotal of all of these devices, all that bandwidth is traveling over this wire and get combined with the bandwidth of this wire. And that combined bandwidth requirement travels over this wire to the router. So one question is, does this wire have the capacity to provide enough bandwidth for all of these devices? It's a very important question because in a 1 gig, we call it a 1 gig network where these devices are capable of 1 gigabit per second. That's the capacity of this one wire is 1 gigabit. So that's one question. When you have a lot of devices coming into one switch in sort of a star configuration, is this one wire able to carry all the bandwidth? And what happens if this one wire breaks? Is there a backup path, or do all of these devices lose the network? Very important questions. Now, it may be necessary. Let me go back to this. As I mentioned, all of these are on one network. Every device here is capable of seeing and communicating with every other device on the network. But you may not actually want to do that. And they are all sharing the same bandwidth, the same pool of bandwidth. And that may not be desirable because out here on the Wi-Fi, you may have guests, visitors, congregants, and you won't necessarily want them to be sharing the same bandwidth or have access to your accounting system or your audio-visual system. So what can be done is to divide the network into multiple networks, and each one of these networks is isolated from the others. So the audio-visual system cannot see the accounting system. The staff can't see audio-visual. This is called subnetting or virtual networking. And I'm going to add one more to this. Is to have your guest network, your Wi-Fi, on its own separate network. The people on this network, the people who, anybody who enters the sanctuary, who has a phone, who is able to log on to your Wi-Fi, can only get to the internet. So you see this wire here goes up to the switch and goes up to the router. It cannot see any of these other networks. It's a safety and security protocol. Let's take a closer look at Wi-Fi. Here's a typical Wi-Fi access point. A Wi-Fi access point is actually a radio transmitter and receiver. It's how your phones communicate. Now, when you were talking about transmitters and antennas for AM, FM, television, typical practice, and you see this all over the place, is to put one big antenna in the middle of town or on the edge of town, and that one antenna covers the entire city. But that's a very different set of wireless frequencies, radio frequencies, than Wi-Fi is. Wi-Fi doesn't travel very far, and walls and ceilings can actually block the signal, which is why you can't put one device in the middle of a room, in the middle of a floor of a building, and expect it to serve the entire building, the entire floor. So what we do is we spread them out. We put in multiple Wi-Fi access points, and we put them in places where there are people. So we don't put them in storage rooms. We don't put them necessarily in hallways where there's not a lot of people space around them. We put them in offices. And in this diagram, which is called a heat map, the red area is a high signal strength area, yellow is a bit of a lower signal strength area, and green is lower still. So we want to make sure that people are contained within the red areas as much as possible. This is another sort of heat map, and this is for an entire large building. And you can see by this that they're very concentrated in certain areas where they need to be, and less concentrated in others. And there's like no service right down here because that may be an empty office space. It may be a parking area. You don't need service there. So this is not a heat map per se, but this is a planning diagram. Now, a couple of things to note about Wi-Fi and how it works. There are basically two bands, the 2.4 gigahertz band and the 5 gigahertz band. 2.4 has been around for many, many, many years. 5 gigahertz is the newish, it's no longer new, band. Now, in the 2.4 gigabit band, it may surprise people to know that there are only 3 channels, just 3 channels that everybody communicates on. Those 3 channels are free and clear of each other and they don't overlap. But you don't want, when you're planning out multiple access points, you don't want to have 2 adjacent access points that have coverage areas that overlap on the same channel. Now, if you're traveling by car between cities and you're listening to an AM or FM radio station, and you're getting farther away from one, and in the next city, there's another station on the same channel, you will hear both of them at the same time. You don't want to do that. That's called interference. And it reduces your ability to understand either of the stations. So you want to have adjacent access points on different channels. But when you only have 3 to choose from, that can get very difficult. The 5 gigahertz band has a number of channels. It has like 20, 25 channels. So it's much easier to do a planning like this. And you'll see this is a 5 gigahertz channel. That's a 5 gigahertz channel. All of these are 5 gigahertz channels. And because they're on different channels, they can overlap without interfering with each other. And that's it.
I was with you right up until that last slide.
Okay.
I just had a visit from my cable man just this morning talking about 2.4 and 5.0. Would you go back in your talk and reiterate that part of it?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I hope I'm speaking for other people. I might be.
Let me just get my screen set up here.
I think the salient point there is that if you're setting up Wi-Fi access in your congregation and you need multiple points, that whoever is setting it up understands the details of it and sets it up properly. That's really the key,
Right.
the key detail there. And knowing this as a background helps you understand whether or not the person you're thinking of hiring to do it really knows what they're talking about.
Right.
If you just have, if you have a volunteer that just goes out and buys a bunch of Wi-Fi access points and sprinkles them around as repeaters, you may not be getting what you want.
Right.
So when you, if you were to take out your phone, everybody can take out your phone right now and go to your Wi-Fi page and look to see what networks are available. Depending on where you are, you'll see your own Wi-Fi,
Right.
but you may see a dozen others. Now, all of them are transmitting on some frequency, and you'll see that each of them have a signal strength meter. If your Wi-Fi unit is operating on the same channel as somebody else's Wi-Fi unit that has a strong signal strength where you are, you will decrease the efficiency of your Wi-Fi. So
Right.
you'll be more apt to lose your Wi-Fi signal or have slow service if you have another Wi-Fi unit with a strong signal strength where you are, because your phone doesn't know which one to talk to. And so the important point of this is to give you just enough information for you to have a meaningful conversation with your IT people. And if you have any questions, shout us out on the Discord. Be happy
Got
to
it.
help.
Thank you.
Any questions from our audience?
Let me check. Sue Royer still wants to know how much bandwidth she needs to purchase.
That's something that we can't answer for you because we don't know how many devices you have on your network, what your streaming requirements are. And there's a lot of things. So that would come out. So that the needs assessment will touch on that and will give us some idea of how deeply to probe. But you really need to consult with a networking person if you have a large building or network. If you have a very small facility with only a few needs, then it would be easier. But it's not something that we can answer off the top of my head because it's different for everybody.
Leo?
So Marty's absolutely right about the needs for bandwidth is very varied. There are some things that that can help you along the way. So you should be able to see my Zoom settings here. Hopefully you can see it. I don't know if I
Yep.
can zoom in a bit
I got it.
closer. But if you go into the statistics on Zoom, it does actually tell you your bandwidth settings, and it tells you how much bandwidth you're using. So as you can see here at the moment, I'm using 1.2 meg up and down to send and receive to get the bandwidth in. So that helps to actually know. The other thing, if you're interested at the same point, well, the other one that you can look at is that you can look at the video settings, and this is telling you the resolution that you're going in and out on Zoom. So at the moment, you can see my send resolution is 720p. So what this call is in HD. Typically Zoom is not in HD unless you set it to HD, which you have to use a Facebook portal to go in there. You'll see the receive is very low because I'm watching you, I'm watching in a gallery mode. But if I go and pin Marty, hopefully you can see, can you see my resolution has popped up really fast on here? And my bandwidth has also now will have gone up on the receive. I'm now receiving 2 meg. I'm getting 2 meg of beautiful Marty. So there you go. That's how you can see how much bandwidth you're using if you're using Zoom.
On top of that, if Marty were to be really active on the screen and he had a lot of busy stuff going on, the bandwidth would go up even further. The algorithms
Absolutely.
for figuring out how to pass video through Zoom has to do with how much change information there is in the picture. If you have a static shot of a candle, low resolution and a low frame rate, it's not going to use a lot of bandwidth. If you have somebody doing a lot of moving around, or you're sharing a video stream with music, bandwidth skyrockets. So depending on what kind of picture you're trying to get across, your bandwidth will change. If we were to show you an Excel spreadsheet, that's static information. Your bandwidth is going to come way down. This is another thing that plays into figuring out, and these calculations can all be done to determine what you need in your facility. But you can be mindful in the setup of your both your network and the gear that you're using. Well, what are the static shots actually using? If you consolidate shots into a single switcher and you're only sending out one stream, well, you've just reduced the bandwidth overall that the network needs. The network at my church requires a lot of bandwidth because we're using cell phones and pads and whatnot. They're all separate connections. So we're using a lot of bandwidth, and we're doing okay. We're lucky we've got a decent network. But if we wanted to bring that number down, yeah, do exactly like Marty says. Take all your camera shots and put them into a switcher and have someone actually manage that. And it'll help reduce the networking needs. And it'll also improve the overall picture, fewer dropouts and interruptions.
There's also a matter of resolution versus frame rate. So when you're setting up your streaming, you can set it up at a 1080p resolution or a 720p resolution, and then you can set it up for 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, or 15 frames per second.
Or 24.
Or 24. So higher resolution requires more bandwidth. Higher frame rates require more bandwidth. So you could trade those off. Now, with the statistics area that Leo showed, when you do different things in Zoom, you will see your bandwidth change. So by having a picture like we're doing now, you'll see one bandwidth. But if we go to share a screen, the bandwidth will be completely different. It may go up, the resolution may go up to 1080p, whereas our regular pictures are only 720. Also, the kind of audio that you're putting out. Now, audio doesn't have as big an impact on bandwidth as video does, but 2 channels of audio for stereo will be twice the bandwidth as 1 channel for mono, right? Audio at 20 kilohertz full bandwidth resolution, like hi-fi audio, will use more bandwidth than audio that is more constrained to provide telephone quality or voice only quality audio. So when you want the best quality music out to play out, then you're using high quality audio, hi-fi audio, and stereo, which will use more bandwidth than if you have echo cancellation turned on and you're using just standard voice. So when you're doing network planning and you want to know how much you should buy, you have to think about worst case scenario. What is the maximum amount of bandwidth I will ever need for my biggest event? You also want to add into that all of the bandwidth that your other devices will need. So your office computers, your online printers, any other communications, your RE computers, your YOUU phones and tablets, and whether they're doing something with YouTube or not, is all using bandwidth. So you really have to do a calculation of all of the different users and the maximum amount of bandwidth that they will ever need if everybody is in the church and everything is going on at once. Because if you don't plan for the maximum, then at some point you're likely to run out of gas.
Indeed. May I
Jay?
jump in?
And so, a couple of things just to think about are if you have a fair amount of activity in your sanctuary building during the work week, imagine you have, not only maybe your staff, but if you rent the building, you have tenants in the building, you're providing internet for the building, you could have multiple tenants all using Zoom at the same time. For those of you who may be in a household where you're not the only person who's holding a Zoom meeting during the day, in my house, it could be 3 people having a meeting simultaneously. I have friends, colleagues who have more than, maybe at least 3, but maybe more, because they may have children at home doing distance learning at the same time. They and a partner are also doing Zoom as well. So I guess the thing to just think about is you probably should, you probably already have internet. That's probably number one. I can't imagine there are many UU congregations that don't have internet in the building, and probably you also have Wi-Fi in the building as well. You may have already been doing, some UC communication. And if you've run into glitches because of internet, either reliability or bandwidth, you may have already bumped into some of the constraints of having a low bandwidth network. But those things can be fixed. They can be addressed. You can purchase more bandwidth from an internet provider most of the time, and you may be able to upgrade network capacity as well. If you have an older system, maybe your switches are 100 megabit, not gigabit, and so you may have lower wired cable capacity around the building as well. That is
J-Lo?
I wanted to ask this question that's in the box about segregating the networks from guest access. So you talked a little bit about possibly having 3 separate places that would need access to the internet: the administrators, the service itself, the streaming service, and then the people attending the service. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Or
Yeah.
make it clearer?
Sure. So segregating is, there are a couple of ways to do that. We call it subnetting or virtual networking. And it's a way of setting up it requires a specific kind of router and switches that are capable. And so what it does is it electronically sets up multiple networks that are isolated. So remember I said that the switch is aware of all of the devices on the network. And if a communication comes from one device that is addressed to another device on the network, the switch is aware of all those devices and can route that message from one device to another device. When you separate the networks or isolate the networks, those 2 devices are on different networks, they will be invisible to each other. One device will not be able to discover them. You won't be able to do a file explorer to see them. The only thing that you'll be able to do is communicate to other devices on the same network and get out to the internet. So that's something that your IT people will set up within your network in the router and the switches. Now, on your home router, if you know how to get into your settings, you may find something called a guest network. And it's for your Wi-Fi specifically, and that's also what that is. Leo?
So there's a lot of ways to do VLANing, which is what Marty is talking about. One of the simplest approaches that you want to do, and you can see this if you think about it, is separate your traffic physically. I find it a lot easier in a lot of cases to physically, say this network is separate, so we put it down different cables. It's actually in a way cheaper, more, your brain works easier thinking they're just different routes, and it keeps the things apart, and it may be far, far easier, because where it becomes really difficult in VLANing is when you've got multiple points on different network, different routers that have got to connect. And what you are only doing is you're separating the traffic. They're still colliding and going down the same piece of copper. So if you try and separate them, you're not actually getting more bandwidth. You're just saying that they don't talk to each other, but they still will try and go down the same piece of copper. The easiest way to solve it and to double your bandwidth is 2 pieces of copper. And the cheapest thing at the moment in the world, quite honestly, is Cat6 cabling. Putting in a couple of extra runs of Cat6 is a damn sight cheaper than expensive equipment that nobody can get their head around.
Yep, you can do parallel networks is what we call that, where you have multiple wires going to multiple switches, and each one of those is a different network. But they will all come back into one main switch, and that switch needs to know how to allocate all of the ports for those wires and to keep them separate. So at some point, you do need to have VLAN set up in at least the main switch so that it knows that port 1 is network A, port 2 is network B, port 3 is network C.
That's true, but you can be, to Leo's point, you can be smart about it. In a lot of the systems that we install, we might, for example, have a lot of audio passing over Dante. And we just say, no, set up a separate switch, separate physical network. It's just carrying the Dante and some control stuff. And it never needs to get to the internet. It never needs to get to the business network, none of that. You can have a whole separate network, and all it does is feed the audio console and a few other devices, the amplifiers, et cetera. But it's a contained network, and it doesn't impact any of the rest of what you're doing. So you can have smaller physical networks carrying lots of bandwidth and doing lots of work to feed the one device that's going to take all of what you're trying to do, choosing it selectively and saying, okay, this is what's going to go out on the Zoom call, or this is what's going to go out on the stream. And that stream is the only thing that ends up hitting your router to get out into the internet. So you can create a hybrid of, there's that word hybrid again, a hybrid of isolated physical networks that are doing specific tasks, aggregating that, and you only have to deal with one stream that has to be handled by the bigger switch or the more central corporate switch.
And as you can see, there are multiple ways of skinning this cat. We can do isolated networks, which is something that we do commonly do when we're dealing with AV-centric networks, like networks that are communicating actual audio, digital audio and digital video around a room, a studio, a sanctuary, or a facility, in order to keep the maximum bandwidth available for those devices in that network. It will be isolated from everything else, except maybe we'll have one port somewhere that is very selective about what information passes through it to get to the internet. Now, just to touch on something that Mark mentioned, he mentioned the word Dante. Dante is
Sorry for throwing that out there.
No, that's all right. That's all right, because it's very relevant. Dante, AV over IP, what's the other one?
AVB, audio video bridging.
AVB, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are networking techniques that carry digital audio and or video, so that, and it carries multiple channels of audio and or video between devices. So if you want to set up 2 mixers, one for mixing in the room and a different one for mixing the stream, we'll talk about why this is a good idea soon. You'll want to, each mixer has 16 channels coming into it from the stage. You want to have all of 16 of those channels available at both mixers. But what you don't want to do is to have 16 wires from the stage to the first mixer, and then another 16 wires from that mixer to the second mixer.
You mean like the good old analog days?
Like the good old analog days, when we used to actually have to do that for like
Yep.
32 or 48 channels, right?
96, 120.
Break your
In a
back carrying the snakes.
Right.
Jay has a storied past in that world.
So today, fortunately, technology has come to our rescue. We can put 64 channels going in of audio going in both directions, so 128 channels on a single pair of Cat5 cable, which is huge. And then we can have that Cat5 cable going into switches that connect to computers, mixers, stage devices, streaming devices, wireless microphones, all communicating audio to each other over just a regular Cat5 wire, which is really cool. But it's a network. It's a network, and we can do video. Like there's AVB video, there's AV over
NDI.
IP, and there's NDI. So these are different network protocols, like different languages.
SDI too, right?
SVSI,
no, SDI is-
SDI.
there's
there's
SVSI,
there's
NDX.
so many acronyms.
There's a lot
Right.
out there.
SDI is not a network, but SVSI is a network.
Okay.
So
Right.
there are different ways of communicating digital audio and video over networks. And that's one of the important things that will be decided early in your project planning, is how are different devices going to communicate with each other? How are the cameras going to communicate, get connected to the switches? How are the audio consoles going to communicate? How are they all going to communicate to whatever streaming device is, whether it's streaming from a computer or from a hardware streamer? Go ahead, Jay.
I just simply want to say that as we leverage the network more and more, it's really important to invest and make sure you've got a robust network. In some cases, you may want to build redundancy in so that if you lost a switch, you would still be operating. And those are all, decisions that get made in the planning stages. We didn't, in the analog days, if your console power supply failed, if you didn't have another console sitting around somewhere, you couldn't get up and running. But there, now and you'd have to unplug all your analog audio lines, plug them into a new console, to a degree today, it's much easier to plan for more robust and fail-safe network plans. And you have, I think to a degree, you just need to keep it in mind, particularly as you invest more and more in moving audio and video around in a sanctuary on the network. So the topic itself is really important.
Yeah. To zoom the question back out a little bit, George makes an important point. We are getting pretty deep in the weeds here. We're getting very detailed in the technology that we're talking about. All this is to say, as it was mentioned, there are many ways to skin this cat, and being mindful of the fact that you can do this in a variety of ways, some more costly than others, some more complicated than others. You can manage this, but it depends on how you're going to set things up. And we can give very specific answers to you if we have the plans for your setup in our hands. And that's part of what we're trying to do here, is get you to the point where understanding or being exposed to all of the aspects, you now know what questions to start asking and what things to start looking for. And again, that's what a lot of the panelists here and a lot of the people that are just sitting and listening right now, there are a variety of experts in these topics that can help. And hopefully we've got a community that can help do that with you. So you don't have to get too lost in what we're saying right now. We're just trying to expose you to all of these terms and all of these concepts and concerns.
Right.
I think there's one thing that really, there's a base of everything that really is key here that you'll hear a lot, which is about the cable itself. And everything that we talk about, really, the cabling in the building, which really hasn't changed for about 25 years. There are new standards, but Cat 5 is the base standard that most things are on. Typically now, if you do an installation, you'll do Cat 6. There is a newer versions of 7 and 8, but at this moment in time, unless anybody can contradict me, there's nothing really that's touching the need of that cable at the moment. But if you're sitting there saying, what am I doing today? What do I need to do? Well, you need to get data to certain points. You've got to pull those cables in. And that's obviously the first thing you need to do. And it's a cost, is to get Cat 6 in. And if you're pulling in one cable, it literally costs the same amount of money to pull one cable as it costs to pull in two. So if you want to be able to be, if ever there is ever a time when I hate using the word future-proof, because there's nothing that's future-proof, but I will always say, if you're going to pull one cable to somewhere, pull in two, because it will always benefit. You'll always suddenly realize you could do with that second cable, and it's the cost of putting it in. Get that in is the first thing. It is always what I recommend.
To answer Keith Miller's question about Cat 6 and Cat 5 cables, when I started this, Cat 3 was the most recent. It shows you how old I am. As the categories increase, the amount of bandwidth the cable can handle increases. Cat 5 cable was Cat 5, Cat 5e, things like that were a certain amount of bandwidth, and they kept getting better. And then they finally said, oh, we're going to go to category 6. From a very technical standpoint, it's how many times the wire twists each inch and all of this other stuff. But ultimately, the higher the number, the more bandwidth you can do. There are varieties within each one. I mentioned 5 and 5e. Cat 6 also has Cat 6, Cat 6a, Cat 6a shielded. If you're going to use a specialized platform, for example, if you're going to use SVSI from AMX Corporation, they will tell you point blank, you will be using Cat 6a shielded cable between your video endpoints. So if you're going to choose, if you're in the position where you're using a specialized product from a commercial manufacturer, you do need to pay attention to the cabling needs that they are recommending for their product. For most of what we're going to be talking about, Cat 5, Cat 5e is probably plenty. If you're installing new cable, just do Cat 6 or Cat 6a. Go to the better cable. It's worth the extra money per foot for it, and you won't regret having done it.
Yeah, actually, that's right. And the higher the category number, the higher the bandwidth, the distance also changes. So there's that. But if you're, as I agree, if you're installing new cable,
what do you mean
go
the
for the
distance
better
changes?
Well, so there's a limitation on the distance that Ethernet can travel over a single piece of wire. And with Cat 5, Cat 5e, it's generally 330 feet. At somewhere before 330 feet, you would put a booster in or a switch, which regenerates the data clock. So that data travels in packets. It looks like square waves if you were to look at it on an oscilloscope. And when it gets too long, there are losses in the wire that change the shape of the data signal, the waveform, and it becomes very hard to read. And that's when you get packet losses and data losses and bit losses. And so you put a switch in there, a small switch or a regenerator, and it reshapes up the clock and sends it up to another 330 feet. Now, when you get into higher category cables with more twists per inch, then the length of the actual copper may be 330 feet, but because of the tighter twists, the overall piece of wire will be shorter because the wire is twisted.
Marty, I'm pretty sure it's 100 meters or 330, regardless of Cat 5 or Cat 6.
I've seen different. I've seen
standard.
reports of differences, but generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, it's 330 feet. There are other considerations depending on the device that's being powered, that's being used. It might require power. So, like a Wi-Fi access point requires power. You could use a wall wart local power supply and plug it into the wall. But if that's mounted on a ceiling, that's going to be very inconvenient to do. So we use what's called power over Ethernet. The switch is capable of delivering power to devices that are connected to it. And there's a couple of different versions of PoE based on the power requirements of the device. And that can affect what kind of wire you're actually using. So it's another consideration in network planning is how much power will the switch be called on to provide? How many devices will need power? How much power will they all need? So it's another consideration for network planning. But if you're going to be putting in new cable, put in Cat 6, put in Cat 6 shielded, and then you should be covered for any eventuality. Because the goal is for future proofing. You don't want to put it in now and then in 3 years when you want to put in a new device that you hadn't even thought about yet, find out that it needs a different cable than you put in. So put in the best cable you can now. Copper's cheap. Cry once, buy once. Buy once, cry once.
And if you have to traverse longer distances than 100 meters, you may want to pull fiber instead. Or
that's a very good option. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like if you're going between buildings, for instance,
yeah,
and you have all of the devices in the building, and we talked about this in the presentation, all of the devices in the building go to one switch, and then there's generally one wire that goes to the main building where the actual internet connection is. That wire can only handle as much bandwidth as the wire is rated for. Now, there are a couple of ways around that. You could put in 2 wires, which will double your bandwidth between buildings, or 3 wires. But you can also put in a single fiber, which can handle just gads of bandwidth over a single piece of fiber that's really, really thin and easy to handle and not a lot of money. It's also much more reliable too. Where are we with questions? Maybe network design should be its own show. Yeah, maybe. Would it be this show? I don't know. There's actually a lot of really good information that you can find on YouTube and at manufacturers' websites. If you're interested in network design and learning how to do network design, learning how to do network analysis, learning for planning and such, there's a lot of really good information out there. There's a company called Solar Winds who happened to have been in the news just a few weeks ago. They were the subject of the huge government hack. They're a company that provides software for network monitoring. So if you want to know how well your network is working, you want to know how much bandwidth you're using, whether any devices are being blocked, if there's, lots and lots of things. That's a company that can provide this analysis software, but they have a number of video resources that can give you really good information. There's another company out there called Ekahau, Ekea Hau, I think it is, Ekahau. They provide software planning for Wi-Fi specifically. They're really good at it, and they have some really good videos. Now, if you want a really good lesson on networking in general and VLANs, then go to Dante's website
that would be Audinate.
Audin.
The
Thank you, Jay.
company
Yes,
that, yeah,
Audinate, Audinate.
yes.
They're an Australian company. They are the authors, the inventors of the Dante network. Go through their training program, their certification program, levels 1 and 2. They explain networking better than any other I've ever seen. They were hugely useful to me.
There's Viant Corporation boils down Dante pretty well if you want a condensed view as well. I think there's another couple of companies that their training programs actually do a good job at explaining a lot of this. But yeah, the programs from Audinate are terrific.
Yeah, they just went through general networking like
right.
really well.
Right. There was a really good comment that at least I thought. George Carville said it might be nice to give or point to info that tells us bandwidth for various devices in various scenarios. Then we could select and count it up. It's a great idea.
Yeah, I'd like to find that.
We can actually do that. We did that today. We could, for example, take a look at, take a cell phone and join Zoom with it, point it at a candle. How much bandwidth does pointing a phone at a candle really chew up in a Zoom call? We could actually gather information and share it with each other out here. And you could say, okay, well, this static shot of a candle costs me this much bandwidth, and the minister's costing me this much bandwidth when he gets really active. And we could actually probably put together something that would help you calculate that. But it's not something I want to do alone. I would kind of want people that have some time on their hands to do some of those measurements and contribute.
And that's really easy for anybody to do because Zoom is an application that actually tells you how much bandwidth you're using and how much resolution it's giving you for that bandwidth. I wish that YouTube would do the same thing, and Vimeo and just a general website, email. How much bandwidth does that use? If you're sending a large file or a video file or an audio file, and you're uploading it to Dropbox or Google Drive, how much bandwidth is that using while it's uploading? That would be really good information to find out.
I want to remind everybody that you're talking to a panel of people that do this all day, and we use a lot of words that mean huge things to us and may mean absolutely nothing to you. Stop us and ask when we start using words that you don't understand, because you're not the only person who doesn't understand that word. So just stop us and say, what was it you just said? For example, when I said Dante, a bunch of them went, oh yeah, Dante. A lot of people went, what's he talking about? So stop us and ask.
And your opportunity to do that actually is coming up, because at 8:30, we're going to, in just a few minutes, we're going to end the formal part of the show. We're going to allow everybody to unmute their microphones as needed, and we can have an open Q&A. So instead of writing your questions in the Discord, we can actually talk to each other. And that's just coming right up. So it's 8:26 now, 4 minutes from now.
Do you want to tell people what next week's show is going to be about, Marty?
Oh, that's a really good idea.
While you're pulling that up, I Googled Zoom bandwidth requirements and a chart came up of how to calculate Zoom bandwidth requirements for various things, static screens, audio, streaming, etc. So there is some stuff already out there. God bless the Google.
Go to the Google.
So next week is March 4th. And so we're going to, for the first half of the show, we're going to look at the second priority in our list, which is sound. Now that's a very deep pool, as we talked about. So we're going to start at the shallow end and talk about some of the higher level stuff that everybody can appreciate. Is all of the volunteers who do sound can certainly appreciate the work that they do. And the music director and the ministers should certainly appreciate the work that audio volunteers do. But it's also equally important for committee members and the board and congregants to understand what they do, because it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of dedication. It takes a lot of time to learn. There's a fairly steep learning curve. I mean, you can learn the surface stuff in just a few minutes. You can push a fader up, it goes louder, pull a fader down, it goes lower, but there's so much more to do, more to it than that. And then there are rehearsals, and there's time to configure things and make things work the way you want them to. And there's preparation work that goes into it, and a lot of study from home. And if you're recording and then post-producing, that's a whole other effort. And, last week we talked about a story that I'd heard about where one day, because just of an innocent scheduling snafu, the audio volunteer didn't show up one Sunday. And the minister was standing there without a clue in the world. How do I even turn this thing on? And he wrote a letter that was published to the congregation and published to the Ministers Association and published on Facebook about how much he now appreciates his audiovisual volunteers. So we're going to talk about, we're going to wade into that kind of slowly and talk about some of those things. So that's the first half of next week's show. And for the second half of the show, we're going to get into something that's really interesting and even potentially even deeper, is copyright licensing. We have some really big things planned to talk about copyright licensing coming up in the next few weeks. And once I get those nailed down, I'll be able to announce them. But next week, we're going to have our own Crystal V talk about Creative Commons. Creative Commons is an organization that has some very artistic members who contribute their work for license-free, royalty-free use. Crystal, you want to give us a little brief introduction to that?
Sure. Put me on the spot.
You should have seen it coming.
I did. It's all good. Creative Commons started actually in 2001, and basically what happened was, as our memory serves, the White Stripes put out an album, of a bassist threw a bass line over it and put it on his website, and they kind of some discussion back and forth between Jack White and this guy in question, and verbal approval was given essentially. Other things evolved. Mashups became a thing, music across the internet, and basically there was a question of, with artists, hey, what do we do if we don't necessarily, we want to let people collaborate with us or remix our music or what have you. We're not going to be snots about it, because they're helping us promote our stuff. So that's good for us, and it's good for them because they get exposure and, try something fun and new. And whole ecosystems have been built out of this. And basically what happened was, is because copyright is this box that is very hard and has very distinct edges, a group of internet nerds got together and said, well, what if we write our own? and thus Creative Commons was born. Keep in mind, Creative Commons is not the same thing as royalty free. It is not the same thing as public domain. They are different areas altogether. It's not the same thing as fair use either. So please do not get those twisted. But Creative Commons basically is a large, I believe at the last I read, it was somewhere around 1.6 billion works in the Creative Commons worldwide. I don't remember how many member countries there are, but this spans audio, video, like images, code. There are cooperative health efforts, things like that. I mean, there are people working on COVID who are working on data that is open under Creative Commons. So this is a really big deal, and it encompasses a lot of things. The downside is Creative Commons is changing right now, so there's actually some flux going on, which I'll talk about more next week. So you're going to have to come and hear more about that. The main big takeaway, though, for it, before I go too far into the weeds, is that this is how you get free stuff. It's cool free stuff, and it's free stuff you can use to make your ministry more awesome.
That does sound awesome. Thank you so
Yay.
much. Looking forward to that. Well, that's it then. We're actually a little overtime. I'd like to thank all of our panelists and our guests today for such a wonderful conversation. We all hope that you've enjoyed our time together. Perhaps you found it informative, enlightening, enriching, energizing, and motivating. Watch the Discord for further announcements and agendas for future shows, and where you can find the recordings. Weeks 1 and 2 are now up. Week 3 will be coming shortly, and then this one after that. Now remember, this is new ground that most of us are only first exploring, and brings all new possibilities, and there's no prior model that we can copy or emulate. We're making this up as we go along. This whole thing about hybrid ministry. So, and there are lots and lots of opportunity. I was talking with someone just recently about if you have, the capacity and a stage and a setup to do music performances, then please, please, please go for that. Consider that. There are small bands that haven't been able to play in a bar for over a year. And I've seen some really good bar bands. People are writing their own music, but they're small artists and they don't have the resources to go up on Spotify or YouTube or any of that. But you could potentially provide them with a space to perform and be able to stream out for them. They would love that. It's a way to engage with your community. It's a way to serve your community. It's a way to bring artists into your church that you can potentially call on later, right? So think big, reinvent your ministries, redefine your communities and who you choose to serve. Dare to dream. So the Discord is open. We'll see you there. We'll see you next week. And our service continues. Thank you so much.